to look at public space in particular, the space between buildings, because that's where you get what they call social cohesion, because everybody's in that space. It doesn't belong to this institution or that family or that thing.
Yeah.
It's a space that we all inhabit. And I think the way we design public space will be an opportunity for us to really say that, because as Africans we're very sociable.
Yes.
We privilege social relations above other things. So those things all happen in public spaces. And we haven't really developed a kind of a modern thinking about how as Africans in African cities develop public spaces. They generally happen organically. But the way we design them should reflect our culture and our social relations.
Yes.
In the Western world, public space is really for leisure only. Green, and they have certain principles about public space. For us, public space is not only about leisure, it's about social, it's about cultural, and it's about trade and opportunity. So there's a different way we use public space. So for me, that I think my interest is in understanding public space better.
Welcome to Unhinged Podcast, a design discourse, the show where we explore the ideas, people, and projects shaping our built environment and the cities of tomorrow. Today, we are joined by an international award-winning architect and urban designer whose influence spans South Africa and across Africa. With over 25 years of experience, their work reflects a deep commitment to culture, heritage, and inclusive design. Their projects don't just shape skylines. They tell stories, preserve identity, and create places where everyone can belong. How are you, sir?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have you. How do you personally define architecture beyond its physical structures, and how has your understanding evolved over the years?
I think architecture is an expression of ourselves and our cultures. In other words, it's a reflection of our worldview, how we relate to each other, how we relate to ourselves, and also how we relate to the natural environment. Because architecture is like a mediation between us and nature. So that's how I view it. It's really one of the cultural ways we express ourselves.
That's more of a way of life, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell us your journey into architecture? Why architecture of all things? You could have picked art, you could have picked social work, you could have picked anything.
No, I actually wanted to do art initially. I'd always been doing art since I was young, since I was a child. I've always been making things, drawing, that kind of thing. And then it was introduced to me by an art teacher who said, hey, there's this thing called architecture, why don't you look into it? And at that time, I think my parents were building a house. So I got interested to see, you can actually think about how the space around you should be. And it's a very creative way, because you start with nothing and then you end up with a whole building. So that's what kind of steered me into architecture from the art world.
What if you had to describe like your design philosophy in 3 words, right? What would it be?
Do no wrong.
Do no wrong.
Yeah, do no harm.
Do no harm.
I think more and more these days, we need to be careful of how we treat Mother Nature in particular. So this whole thing around sustainability and being able to sustain ourselves as a species on the earth has become quite central to a lot of ways we think about making architecture. So I would say it's as human beings we are visitors on the planet. So we need to behave like visitors.
There need to be like a correlation between us, what we build or design, and our environment.
That's it. Yes.
Okay. How have international architectural trends influenced your work? And how do you ensure that your projects maintain an authentically African identity?
Well, internationally, I mean, we've always been interested in how different countries and different peoples used architecture to create their societies. So whether it's kind of an Islamic culture and how their architecture then is reflected through some of their practices and their beliefs, whether looking at Latin American countries, which have kind of similar context to us here. So I'm always interested to look like all over the world at different cultures. It also helps us to understand what makes us different as Africans. And it's a life's journey to try and see how better we express how we are as Africans.
Yeah, because personally, I think for us who are upcoming young designers, we have run into that state of modernity and contemporary. So we are like further away from the African architecture. And every time we think of design, it's not from that point of history and all that.
Yeah, I mean, our development was interrupted by colonialism. If there hadn't been colonialism and we'd been able to modernize without being dragged into this other world, I think things would have turned very differently. But, it's what it is. We have this heritage. And we have to work with it. We have a triple heritage that Professor Mazrui, famous African political and cultural scholar, said that as Africans we have a triple heritage. It's our own indigenous heritage. We have a kind of a Christian heritage and an Islamic heritage in some places. And that's the melting pot that we are. So this is how we have to navigate.
Yeah, to tackle that. Okay. In your view, what role does architecture play in shaping not just physical spaces, but also societal mindsets and behaviors?
So they say architecture discriminates. In other words, as soon as you put a wall, you're saying who can be on this side and who can be on that side. So the fundamental thing of architecture is that it decides who's in and who's out. Not only physically, but just in the expression of a building. You can see that I'm not actually welcome here, or I am welcome. You can see that this is an important place. This is not an important place. Here, these are big people. Here, these are Moronas.
Come on.
So it's another language. It tells stories, and it kind of guides us on what to do and what not to do. So it's very political in that way.
Oh, someone yesterday was asking me, did I think that architecture had like a play in propelling during the apartheid movement?
100%. Architecture was probably one of the most important instruments that was used to not only keep people apart, but to say that these people are better than these ones. So even the way we build today, sometimes unconsciously, we also repeat those kind of things.
Wow.
And with small signs. So when you build a house, and then the helper, if you build a roof for your helper, it won't have the same finish as the main house.
It's always at the back.
And it's always at the back. So you are implying something with the way you've designed. That I'm here, you are there. That's
the segregation.
The segregation.
Okay. You have received many awards throughout your career. How do you view the role of recognition in architecture? Does it influence your creative process? Like, do you design because you know there is an award at the end of it?
Well, awards are nice to receive, and it's kind of a recognition by by your peers that you've done something that they recognize. But I think we don't practice because you want an award. They kind of come. If you try and practice to win an award, you probably will never win. So it's we just do what you think is best and what is right.
But how important is recognition in the architectural industry, in the African context?
It's important because it gives you a voice, like we're sitting here now.
How do you balance the prestige of being an award-winning architect with the groundness required to create socially impactful design?
I kind of try and forget that the accolades or whatever it is. Every project is just a project. I think, and I'm also mostly shy of the media, because they say if you live by the press, you die by the press. So I tend to try and not be too taken up in media and social media stuff like that.
Because
No, I say it can be distracting.
Okay. I was gonna say because I think when you have gained so much experience, right, and then you have progressed so much in your career, you're up there. People tend to run with the projects that are like modern, contemporary city. They forget to make the impact where they are coming from. And in your rural areas, maybe where you need social projects, affordable housing, and stuff like that. Where money is not like
the big thing. I think different architects have different interests, and the field is so vast, which is what makes it exciting. Some like to work in more rural contexts. Some like to work in more urban. Some like to work with social projects. Others like to work with kind of corporate environments. So it's varied. It depends.
Okay. So in what ways can architecture contribute to the process of decolonizing African cities and reclaiming cultural and spatial identity?
We need to look at public space in particular, the space between buildings, because that's where you get what they call social cohesion, because everybody's in that space. It doesn't belong to this institution or that family or that thing. It's a space that we all inhabit. And I think the way we design public space will be an opportunity for us to really say that, because as Africans we're very sociable.
Yes.
We like, we privilege social relations above other things. So those things all happen in public spaces. And we haven't really developed a kind of a modern thinking about how as Africans in African cities develop public spaces. They generally happen organically. But the way we design them should reflect our culture and our social relations.
Yes.
In the Western world, public space is really for leisure only. Green, and they have certain principles about public space. For us, public space is not only about leisure, it's about social, it's about cultural, and it's about trade and opportunity. So there's a different way we use public space. So for me, that I think my interest is in understanding public space better.
Okay. How do you balance honoring traditional African design elements while pushing the boundaries of contemporary architecture?
Well, traditional elements include things like how we design our spaces, how we used to do it traditionally, and what the reasons were for that, and whether those reasons are still relevant today. Then things like materiality, what type of materials we use, and what kind of craft can we bring to bear, that our people are used can work with. So it's about space, it's about material, and representation.
Yes.
Because a building, when you look at it, it tells a story. And trying to bring in a lot of kind of African expressions into the architect. I think it makes it quite interesting.
Yes.
To deal with this modernity and tradition through the way you combine.
So how do you balance aesthetics, functionality, and social impact when designing for marginalized communities?
I think the more constraints you have, the better your architecture.
Really?
Yeah. So if you have little money, you have to work harder to make something beautiful.
Okay.
And it will be even more beautiful. Because if you have a lot of money, it's much easier to just make something to do. But to work with little resources and to have deep respect for where the people you're working for and what it is that you're building. It's actually, it makes the work quite more poetic in a way. Because as I say, if you have money, it's easier to do things.
So that's where you're kind of able to strike a balance between creativity and practicality.
Yes. I think it was Glenn Market, the Australian architect, who said you've got to look for the poetics in the pragmatic. So if you have a pragmatic thing to solve it in a poetic way. And that is that balance. Yeah.
Okay. So how do you ensure that your designs create inclusive spaces that cater for diverse communities and social groups?
In my experience, I've learned, having gone back to a lot of the buildings with design, that you've got to kind of plan for the unintended consequences, because you never know what will happen. So you try and create, there's a concept I call baggy space, which is where you make the space baggy, like your baggy jeans.
Yeah, it's bigger.
It's bigger, so that things can happen.
Move around.
And you can't plan everything right down to the T. And people grow, institutions grow, they change. So there needs to be space and flexibility to move around. So
that's an interesting concept. So how do you define the connection between spirituality and architecture?
Architecture is very spiritual. As I say, it's an extension of the natural world. And that natural world is also a spiritual world. So I think, in a sense, architecture also talks to cosmology, because we're kind of completing what God or whoever you call him has started. So in a sense, we are working in that realm for me. And again, as Africans, we believe in what's known as animism, which is an animistic way of viewing the world, where inanimate objects like your rocks, the trees, are given a kind of a spirituality. So if we understand that the materials we use, the sites that we build on, also have their own spirituality and their own, they're like living organisms, then it impacts the way we understand architecture.
So it's beyond just saying I am building a structure or a building.
Yeah. And also the architecture sits at the junction between psychology and spirituality. Because buildings affect us psychologically. And they also can reinforce our sense of spiritualness.
Okay, I want wanted to ask that, okay, working in a church, yes, I understand, but just a normal building, how?
When you feel at one with yourself in an environment, that's a kind of when you're at ease, that's a kind of, in my view, kind of spiritual, being heightened in a spiritual sense. So it's not about organized religion, which would be a church or something. But for me, spirituality is when you are comfortable with yourself and at ease with yourself. And architecture can assist. So it's a kind of a deep subconscious thing. But there are certain environments you go to and you really feel calm. You feel yourself. And then there are those environments where you're
Because I was reading an article. I think the person is an architect. They were talking about neurodiversity and neuroscience within spaces and all that. So I think that's what you're talking about.
That's 100%, yes. 100% it is. Okay. That's another interest of mine, that kind of neuroscience and architecture and the way the environment impacts on us. Even just through our bodies. Our bodies can, the space around creates different emotions.
So what do you see as Africa's architectural identity, and how do you think it's evolving on the global stage?
Well, firstly, we need to be careful with the term African because it's so diverse that it would be not correct to try and place it as one thing. I know that, it's kind of, especially here, when we talk African, we think only of ourselves. And yet Africa is so vast. The north is different to the east, is different to the south. And a lot of architecture is on the continent has been influenced by the kind of geographical environment. So in mountainous regions, there's a certain architecture. In the desert regions, there's a certain architecture. In the tropical forest, there's a certain architecture. So I think if it's the first time I'm thinking about, if you were to describe it, it's an architecture that tries to work with its context. And in some instances, it's also an architecture which does not see architecture as being permanent structures. So a lot of our structures, they're allowed to fade away. If you move from your village and that village so you don't want to build for 100 years and permanence. So I think there's a clue there in how architecture in Africa is.
Imagine, and back in the history of where we come from, we weren't attached to buildings that were like stationary and solid like that. Right.
There were some instances where there's a history of kind of historical cities. But as you say, I think that our concept was not to build forever, but to build for what we needed now, and then the future generation would also build, and things it's kind of a more temporary way of thinking about habitation.
Okay, and it evolves with errors and stages of lessons from your experience. What one thing you know now that you wish you know when you started your career?
How difficult it is to build a building. It's like it can be a 4-year project. If you're lucky, it's 2-3 years. But it takes a long time to build. It takes a lot of coordination of a lot of people. And sometimes by the time you finish the project, you're somewhere else. And you look back and you say, hey, what was I doing?
Oh, so what happens when you reach that creative block when you are working on a project?
I like to go into nature.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go into the bush or something and forget about the project and completely forget about it. And then it'll start stirring in your head. When you come back, then everything kind of comes out. That's
okay. Do you have any unrealized dreams or project or vision you always wanted to bring to life but have not gotten a chance to do so?
Oh, there are so many.
Please share some.
I'd like to build more in public space all over the continent, working more in developing public spaces in particular. We've done a bit of planning in Maputo, in Mozambique, in Burundi. There was an opportunity in Ghana. It hasn't come quite yet. But yeah, I think for me to build in public spaces, and then also to build culturally significant projects.
Yes, the one project that I love of yours is Cradle of the Humankind.
Yeah.
Because I think it speaks for a convergence of art, history, spirituality.
Yeah.
It brings like everything together like that, heritage and all that.
Exactly. Those are if I could do more of those kind of projects. Because they are about ideas. It's not just a building, but it's about the world of ideas and the world of art and the world of politics. And bringing, as you say, all those ideas together. And it also gives us better sense of who we are, where we come from.
So tell me, how is architecture political?
It's political because it needs a lot of resources, money. And money is politics. Who has the money? Who makes the decisions? It's political, like you see in South Africa, where apartheid literally used architecture to say, you there, we here, etc. But even in more subtle ways, it's an expression of the politics of a place. So if you have a very strong kind of capitalist or neoliberal political system where money is driving everything, you can see it in the architecture. If you have more kind of, like we say here, developmental state, you're supposed to be able to see it in the architecture and where money is going to. Is it going to social good, or is it going to money-making investments? So that balance between the social and the economical is reflected.
How would you say is as like your creative process when you're designing a project? Like they come and say, okay, we want you to design an airport and whatever. What's like your design process to the final?
I think one is to work with the site, the context, try and understand the context quite deeply, both physically, climatically, of course, and all that. But also the history of that site. Did this site, does it have a history? Maybe there used to be something there before. And then, so there's a lot of research as the start into that context. And then there's a lot of play. Once you've got the research kind of in your head, then like any other creative process, you just start playing. And, playing with things and trying things. And then eventually things start to converge. But in the beginning they call it divergent thinking, where you're just playing and not even knowing
There's no specific
thing. So that's kind of using the intuitive process at the beginning.
Oh, okay.
And then something will pop out if you are lucky.
If you're lucky. But then at the end of the day, you need to deliver. So.
Yes, you have to deliver. Yeah. I mean, sometimes it comes quicker, sometimes it takes a long time.
But then, how do you balance that? Because you have deadlines and timelines which you need to meet.
I think with experience, managing time of the design process kind of tells you that, okay, by this time I have to decide this. By this time I have to decide that. And obviously you take big decisions first, and then you get to more and more detail.
Up until you're on
up until you,
Okay. So what would you say? What advice would you give to a young designer, an upcoming architect, an artist? Oh, before we get there, right? How you said you're an artist. Not that you say you're an artist. I read somewhere that you're an artist. You're into music, How do those creative processes influence your design process and creative process in architecture?
Well, music has structure. It has emotions, and it can transport you into that space you need to be in to think creatively. Similar with art, visual arts, they give you ideas. So I can look at a piece of art and it can say something, and you say that's an idea I can use for architecture. So, art all over, whether it's poetry, literature. I used to rely a lot on literature, especially the African writers series, because they talk about African society,
the
Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka's. So in a way you can imagine when they write the kind of spaces
they were
talking about, or the kind of spaces we should be having.
Okay. So what would you change what do you think needs to change in the architecture industry now?
I think architects need to be more mindful about the impact of their projects. And I think we need to really ask this question about who we are as a people, and whether our lives would be better. They said better designed buildings actually make for better economic prospects and better designed cities. So there's a relationship between design and economic prosperity. So if you design something lousy, you're not going to get better results. There's a relationship between design and crime. You can actually design spaces that promote crime or don't promote crime.
Oh, wow.
So I just wish as architects we were more mindful of the power of architecture.
Is that why Dubai is, going higher the way it's going higher because of its architecture being one of its economic diversification?
I haven't really been to Dubai, so I'm not sure how the city works, but I'm not sure.
Okay, so which city would you say represent what you're saying, the economics and the design part?
I think New York.
New York.
The way New York is designed, it's almost like everybody's equal. So they have the same size of apartments, but some people then buy two of them and build them up. But everybody starts off. It looks like on an equal footing. The way the city is designed with the grid system allows for people and goods and everything to flow. And there's an understanding of how people can live quite tightly together, and yet not on top of each other. And living closer together means that we trade easier. If we live far apart, a lot of our African cities, which are low density, that contributes to us not having trade. Fast trade. So that's an example of, and because there's a lot of people, you can get musicians on the corner, and already there's a whole audience. So it's very kind of interesting, I find, as where you can see the design is so different and the outcome is different.
It's different. Okay, that's very interesting too. I at first I didn't think it that way, but now that you brought it to light, I can. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are other cities as well. If you look at Barcelona, which is a very beautiful city, but it's all designed for people to promenade and take long walks and look at each other and admire each other. So it's got, it's got that kind of feel to it. So all cities, I think, have a different personality.
So that's the psychology of architecture you're talking about.
It's that they actually have personalities.
That's very interesting. So what advice can you give to a young architect, a young designer? What advice can you say, okay, this is the thing that I want you to roll with and run with?
Read a lot.
Read a lot.
Yeah. These days, it's difficult to read because we have these devices that we kind of surf information. But I think to be literate, not only in architecture, but literate in society, culture, we need to read. And we need to know, understand philosophy, and all of those things.
It does open up one's mind. Because it does take you to, sometimes it does take you to places and then
Yes. I would say just read a lot.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Mphethi.
Thank you so much.
I thought we were going to take long, but okay.
Oh.
Thank you very much for joining us and listening and watching us. See you next time.
Thank you.